The Shape of Things to Come. That title was given to us a couple of months ago, and the shape of things today probably weren't anticipated at that particular time, and it's obviously an evolving and terribly difficult situation. Matthew Daley has agreed to be with us today. We received a call from Mr. Gelbard's office yesterday, and he had been instructed to return to Bosnia today, which he did dutifully. And so we thought the best thing to do would be to go ahead and have Mr. Daley, his deputy, share the evening with us. Elaine Burke is here. She's on numerous occasions said to me that she really is impressed by the timeliness of our programs, which is a bit frustrating at this point because the Russian ambassador to the United Nations, as you know, had to vote on Mr. Annan's recommendations at the time he was supposed to be here. And Mr. Gelbard is returning to Bosnia on the evening of his address before the Council. So we've been too lucky now, two sessions in a row, and for that we apologize. But we really thank Mr. Daley for joining us. Mr. Daley is a graduate of Tulane University, where he's received undergraduate and graduate degrees. He's also done work at the University of Paris and the University of Wisconsin. He's served in the United States Army for a couple of years, the Treasury Department as a Secret Service officer, and then joined the Department of State as a Foreign Service officer in 1976. Early in his career, he served in Turkey. He's been with the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency and has participated in a couple of negotiations in Geneva on disarmament questions. A lot of his service has been with the Bureau of East Asian and Pacific Affairs, where he served as a special assistant to the Assistant Secretary, and he served as director of the regional office. He's also been director of the of the Office for Philippine Affairs, and he served as deputy chief of mission both in Bangkok and New Delhi. He's taken over his current position as deputy effective August of last year. Bosnia is a fascinating topic. We're absolutely delighted that he's here to share his thinking about it with us this evening. It's my great pleasure to present to you Mr. Matthew Daley.
Frank Bird, thank you for that introduction. Bob Gelbard truly regrets that he's unable to be here this evening. Literally, as we speak, he's crammed into not a first-class seat, but something more modest on an airliner heading across the Atlantic to go back to the region. He remembers fondly his opportunity to address this group a year ago and was truly disappointed that he could not do so today. It's a great honor for me to be here. I'd like to talk to you about the progress that we think we're making in implementing the Dayton Peace Accords, and to give you a few words on why we think U.S. national interests require that we continue that effort. Put simply, U.S. leadership in the Balkans is not only consistent with our moral values, it is also essential to achieving our goals in Bosnia and Europe as a whole. Peace in the former Yugoslavia is closely linked to the expansion of NATO and the strengthening of European security institutions, and these are fundamental to the security of the United States. Achieving a self-sustaining peace in Bosnia will help create stability in what has historically been one of Europe's most unstable regions. Despite the continuing criticism of the Dayton Peace Accords by the skeptics, including those who originally opposed U.S. involvement in Bosnia, I think there's an increasing understanding that the stunning diplomatic achievement of Dayton is now being matched with real progress on the ground, real progress on even the toughest issues of implementation. And the pace of that progress has accelerated even since the start of this year. Bosnia is too important to our national interest in Europe to be left to be the victim of an unfortunate tendency to seek quick fixes, or if a quick fix is not possible, to pull out. Our national interest and the unstable history of the Balkans both argue in favor of a consistent policy, one that will leave the region more stable. We're determined to get it right this time. That's why President Clinton and now NATO as a whole have determined that a continued NATO-led military presence is essential to consolidate the gains we've made and to make the process itself, the Dayton peace process, self-sustaining. As that goes on, however, you'll see both the percentage of U.S. forces involved in Bosnia and the absolute number of troops decline. Towards the end of this year, we expect that number will go down to something under 7,000 from a high of about 20,000 in 1996. At President Clinton's recommendation, NATO has not set a new end date for the new deployment. We determined that having done that in the past was a mistake. We misjudged what could be accomplished within a particular period of time, and we also gave the opponents of Dayton a target. They believed that they could hold on for just another few months, this unpleasantness would be removed from them, and they could get on with their old way of doing things. I alluded to the fact that implementation in the Accords had moved more slowly than we wanted. We knew from the beginning that implementation would be difficult, especially since the basic responsibility for implementing the Accords belongs to the parties themselves, that is, the former warring parties. We made good progress on the military side. We brought about a ceasefire. We separated the forces. We saw a demobilization process that dropped the number of men under arms from over 400,000 down to under 100,000. And we instituted a process of both arms control, eliminated about half the heavy artillery weapons in the country, and put the rest in cantonments under NATO supervision. The process of civilian implementation was not that good, and I would say that although we've seen an acceleration in the last few months, we're probably 6 months to a year behind where we should be today. Let me talk about some of the reasons for that. Bosnia experienced 46 months of the worst fighting in Europe since the Second World War, and that fighting coincided with the worst human rights abuses in Europe since the Second World War. It shattered the structures and the institutions of Bosnian society. We've only had a bit over 2 years to put all of that back together, to try and reknit the fabric of a society. And in doing so, we had to deal with the leadership that was the leadership which led the respective ethnic groups at the time of the fighting. Civilian implementation would have been hard, even if it were undertaken by men of goodwill who had vision and who understood what Dayton called for. Instead, we had to deal with the leadership that in many cases was responsible for the nationalist extremism that led to the war. And this was especially true in the Republic Srpska, which was led by a clique of corrupt xenophobes who were responsible for, in large measure, the war itself and most of the human rights violations that accompanied it. When President Clinton began his second term, he realized that a new and more focused strategy was necessary, and he approved a comprehensive plan in April of last year, a plan that involved reinvigorating our diplomatic approaches to Belgrade and to Zagreb, and a plan that was predicated upon using our NATO forces in the S4 guise to reinforce the civilian implementation aspects when that was needed. At this stage, we found we did not have the same requirement to use the military forces on the military side of Dayton. That was largely accomplished. So we could turn to the civilian implementation role and use military force to back up the International Police Task Force, which is unarmed, and to help lend some muscle to the efforts of the High Representative, Carlos Westendorp, who is the senior representative of the international community in Bosnia, and who is the person that the international community has vested with responsibility to interpret the Dayton Accords. Our strategy was brought to fruition in May of '97 when Secretary Albright convoked a meeting of fellow ministers in Central Portugal and got them on board with the concept of a more vigorous effort. This effort has produced results in areas that are symbolically important, like naming new ambassadors for Bosnia-Herzegovina, to things that are as mundane yet as essential as having a single area code for the entire country. Still, as we're pushing forward, we encountered a lot of opposition in the Republic Srpska, which then had its capital in Pale. The hardline Serb nationalists obstructed or reneged on promises at virtually every turn. Now, I should point out that our policy towards the various parties is even-handed only to the extent that they support Dayton. We're not absolutely neutral. We will support those who favor implementation of Dayton, and we'll actively concert to undermine those who did not. And we carried this approach out in the Republic Srpska. The political changes that have taken place there in the last few months have been key to our success in reinvigorating the implementation of Dayton. The RS President, Biljana Plavšić, early on realized and had the courage to state publicly that Pale's obstructionism and corruption were impoverishing the people of the Republic Srpska. Under her leadership, internationally supervised elections were held in the fall, and those elections broke the overwhelming majority control in the National Assembly that the hardliners had. That, in turn, created the opportunity for a new government led by Prime Minister Dodik, which has committed itself to implementing Dayton and to improving the circumstances for the people and for their constituents. We've seen in just the first couple of months of the new Dodik administration positive steps, not just rhetoric, and let me touch on 4 of these. Prime Minister Dodik has legitimized cooperation with the International Criminal Tribunal that's responsible for Yugoslavia. And partly as a result of that, we've seen for the first time 4 ethnic Serb indictees of that tribunal elect to surrender and to present themselves to The Hague. He has also given approval to the ICTY to open an office in Banja Luka, the new capital of the Republic Srpska. He removed his objections to something which will seem puzzling, but objections to a common license plate. Heretofore, in the different parts of Bosnia, motor vehicles were issued a distinctive license plate which identified the origin of the owner of the car. Now, that can be a source of pride here in the United States. In Bosnia, where police were responsible for the great majority of human rights abuses, that helped identify victims to those who would abuse their rights. And so having a common license plate which does not identify the geographic nor the ethnic origin of the owner of the vehicle is critical to freedom of movement and critical to knitting together the economic and social life of the country. It was a major step. He removed the previous objections to restoration of railroad service and for the first time allowed mail to be delivered from Sarajevo to the Republic Srpska. 5 years and many tons of mail was sitting in a warehouse because they would not accept it. These are serious steps. We were terribly impressed by Prime Minister Dodik when he visited Washington a month ago. He said all of the right things in his meetings with senior officials, in his meetings with non-governmental organizations, with members of the Hill, with think tanks. And we expect that his deeds will follow his words, and we will hold him to performance. The promises alone won't be enough. Now, this change was not simply an accident. A part of it was directly attributable to the policies that we followed to break the control of the gangsters who ruled Pale. Authoritarian regimes rely universally on several levers of power. They rely on the military, the police, and the media. And before the elections, we attacked each of these levers. We were able to neutralize the military earlier through SFOR and made it known to them that there would be significant consequences should they become involved in the political fray. Through the International Police Task Force, we clamped down on the police, and we began a program of identifying those officers who had a professional background that was potentially acceptable for a force that would serve the people and not the state, as opposed to those who had been involved in human rights abuses or who were clearly political hacks. And through this recertification process, we tried to move support truly to the good cops and to deny it to the bad cops. We got involved in some things that were unprecedented. When the television media was spewing forth venom and hatred, the High Representative, Carlos Westendorp, issued a cease and desist order. He was ignored in a uncivil fashion, and upon being thus rebuffed, we sent troops to occupy the transmitter towers and literally pulled the plug and reinstituted, or not reinstituted, we created a new media, a television outlet that gave access to all the political parties, but was not the creature of any one party. We did that sufficiently in advance of the elections that when the voters went to the polls, they were able to make an informed choice. This, I think, was unprecedented in the sort of the history of how the international community has resolved these challenges. We also were very energetic diplomatically in both Belgrade and Zagreb. In Belgrade, we induced the cooperation of President Milosevic. That was based on calculated self-interest, not on a sense of altruism on his part. We have put a lot of pressure on the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia through what we call the outer wall sanctions. That outer wall has basically two components. It's denying membership to the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia in international organizations, and it denies access to international financial institutions. And as a result of this pressure, the economy of the FRY has really suffered greatly, and this in turn has created a powerful incentive for Mr. Milosevic to cooperate with us. He did so in the Republic Srpska, and to acknowledge that cooperation, we're prepared to take some positive steps in reducing or mitigating other sanctions that we unilaterally have imposed. Because of the crackdown in Kosovo, we took those positive steps off the table. The other items on our agenda with Milosevic, if you'll permit me this digression, are internal democratization, peaceful resolution of the conflict in Kosovo, cooperation on war crimes issues, and cooperation on the what we call state succession issues, which are dealing with the claim of various states to be the sole successor to the former Yugoslavia. It's one of these things that makes for interesting debates among lawyers, and to a certain extent it has important implications for divvying up the assets of the former Yugoslavia. We've got some serious media challenges in front of us. One of the ironies of our success in the Republic Srpska is that there's more political pluralism there today, more freedom of expression than there is in the Bosnian Croat Federation. We're going to have to expand political pluralism and independent media in the Federation. You've seen recent reference in the newspapers to an arbitration that's ongoing in Brčko. That falls into the category of immediate challenges. Briefly, Brčko is a strategically located city and, let me use the word county, that connects the two portions of the Serb Republic. It's at the very narrow waist on an east-west axis, so they view it as being of supreme importance to the political viability and indeed the military security of their entity. It also connects Bosnia, the Federation, on a north-south axis with Europe, and so it's of enormous importance to them for their future economic prospects. The arbitrator, Robert Sohan, an American and former legal advisor of the State Department, has postponed making a final arbitral award, and he's made it quite clear in doing so that the conduct of the two parties in terms of observing Dayton, in terms of facilitating refugee returns, in terms of reestablishing a civil society will be key to the outcome, and that misbehavior on their part, and these are my words, not his, very likely will lead them to lose that which they seek. We've made progress on war criminals. 10 months ago, only 7 of the publicly indicted war criminals were in custody. Today, that number is 28. Over the next 6 months, we'll be trying to consolidate the gains that we've made in the Republic Srpska. There will be new elections in the whole country in September, and we're going to push for greater progress in the Federation. We're going to be pressing the Bosniaks and the Croats to cooperate with each other in a way that they have not heretofore been doing. The process of creating genuinely democratic institutions at the local level, the canton level or county level, and at the national level is not an easy one. President Clinton very bluntly told the Bosniak and the Bosnian Croat leaders when he visited Sarajevo in December that the Bosnian Croats must give up their separatist ambitions and cooperate in the important issues at hand, such as getting an IMF agreement and facilitating various assistance agreements. These people were so wrong-headed that they forfeited the opportunity for a $10 million assistance project because they could not sit down and come to an understanding on how the process would be handled. At the same time, the Bosniaks, the Muslim side, must resist the temptation to dominate the less numerous Croats in the Federation. They must genuinely share power, and their record on that score is not an enviable one. We're going to be making a major effort to ensure return of refugees and displaced persons. Our goal is a genuine multi-ethnic environment in both entities. This is key to Dayton's long-term success, and we're going to have to do a lot of work on that. Earlier, we tended to look at that as a one-dimensional problem. We didn't adequately integrate the need to construct new housing or to repair war-damaged housing, of which there's an enormous amount, with programs to integrate the political structures at the local level, improve the police forces, and create job opportunities. You have to do all of these things at the same time if people are going to feel secure in returning, especially as minorities, and if they're going to feel the incentive to know that there is a future for them in the area. So that is one of the high issues on our list. This too will involve more work with Belgrade and Zagreb, as well as work internal to the country. And as we do it, I can assure you that we have been assiduously careful in engaging the rest of the international community so that this is not a case of the United States providing the leadership as well as all of the resources. And we've got a pretty good record on that score. That leaves the difficult problem of Kosovo. Belgrade so far has refused to address that in a constructive manner. Its recent actions in Drenica were brutal, they were disproportionate, the violence was indiscriminate, and they have been roundly condemned by the world community. We have made a conscious effort to avoid the mistakes of the past and have gauged the international community at a very early stage. The Secretary was responsible for the meeting in London on the weekend of March 9th and 10th, a ministerial level meeting to deal with Kosovo, and she will be joined by her fellow ministers in Europe on March 25th, again to focus exclusively on this problem. We believe that a constructive dialogue without preconditions between the authorities in Belgrade and the Kosovo Albanian leadership is the route to break this particular impasse. On Dayton, an awful lot remains to be done. We think we have found the right formula, though, and let me repeat. We need vigorous civilian implementation led by Carlos Westendorp. We need to back that up by a forceful NATO military presence, and we need to combine that with a very robust diplomacy. Our experience in 1997 and thus far this year shows that we can do this only if the United States exerts serious leadership. No other country, no other set of countries have the ability to exercise the kind of leadership that's necessary. Let me close by saying that those who argue for partition or for abandoning Dayton's vision of a multi-ethnic Bosnia, just as we're making some serious real headway, are politically misguided and morally wrong. Polls have repeatedly showed that the majority of Bosnians of all ethnic groups support Dayton and they oppose partition. They do not want to see a return to warfare. An effort to partition Bosnia would be a gross abandonment of our best principles. It would spark renewed violence, and we would very likely be drawn back in and would end up paying a much higher price than our limited engagement now demands of us. Why don't I stop at that point and respond to questions?
Well, thank you very much for the clear overview of both policy and its evolution. The floor is now open for questions. I think the question is, would you comment upon the possible utilization of labor unions and similar civic organizations?
Good summary. I think we need to do more of that. I can't comment on the specific case that you raised, but in general, I think one of the lessons that we've learned over the past year is the importance of encouraging the development of non-governmental organizations, of institutions that will mobilize citizenry and that will monitor what it is the government is doing. For example, there's a proposal that we employ over a couple dozen expat lawyers to look at a particular aspect of judicial reform in Bosnia, which is an area that needs a lot of attention. And our counter proposals, rather than do that, let's give a contract to a Bosnian non-governmental organization, even if we have to be instrumental in creating the organization ourselves. But let's use this as a device to build an institutional legacy and to mobilize people who, in the past, did not participate actively in the political process. One of the challenges in Bosnia is that we're moving from a regime where the people in the leadership had their experience grounded in how the communists ran things, or the particular version of communism that was operative in the former Yugoslavia. Their mental framework was not one that inculcated democratic values and taught them the tricks of the trade of how an open society works. So this is an area where we're going to have to give increased emphasis.
The question is, how does the arrangement today, the territorial arrangement, differ from de facto partition?
The difference is the ability for people to move about freely, which is a work in progress. It is not realized. It hinges in, I think, very large measure on our ability to see that minorities can actually return to the areas from which they originally came. And that is a goal that has broad support. When many of you may have read newspaper articles or seen television stories on violent opposition to return of refugees, and we've had that experience in Bosnia. And usually when we've had it, we found that the people who are most agitated and most opposed to the return of refugees or displaced persons are individuals who themselves are displaced, and they're afraid they're going to be thrown out of the only structure that they now know. And so the challenge for us is to reject the argument that nobody can return until everybody can return, yet have a regional approach. And we've started, in the case of Sarajevo, by fostering what we call the Sarajevo as an open canton plan, which envisages the return of tens of thousands of Serb and Croat displaced persons and refugees to Sarajevo. And when we encountered obstacles from the Bosniak side in the form of foot dragging on legislation that would permit people to reclaim their property or to dispose of their property if that was their choice, returning refugees, we explained that our minds were so preoccupied with that it would not be possible for us to approve any new assistance projects for Sarajevo. And if the obstructionism continued, we'd get so preoccupied we'd have to stop ongoing projects, which is an extraordinarily serious step. I mean, that means you're threatening to stop, for example, a sanitation project, a sewage project that's 75% complete. But we were prepared to do that, and we were prepared to make sure that the people understood who was responsible by name. And we found that that sort of incentive was very productive, and 3 pieces of legislation went through the Assembly. A week or 2 late, but they did get through. So there are dominant pockets of ethnic communities in the different parts of Bosnia today, and if one were to accept partition as a principle, we would not only have to accept the outcome of the ethnic cleansing that preceded the situation, but we'd have to say people cannot return to their homes. And we would enshrine that concept of ethnicity as the basis of the state. And that's something we're not prepared to do on moral grounds. We also think it makes bad policy and would lead to, in all likelihood, renewed fighting, which would create all the imperatives that drove us to Bosnia again in the first place, only we'd have to redo it and it would be more expensive. So we're going to try and avoid doing that.
I think the question is, would you expand on your comment that the United States and its friends are the only countries who could accomplish what they're doing in Bosnia? Is that correct?
Well, my question really was, why is the United States the only country that is capable of doing this? There are countries in Europe who have an interest in this situation as well.
Why do you believe the United States has to play the leadership role in the enforcement of the Dayton Accords?
I would argue that if one of the lessons of the modern history of Bosnia is that European countries individually and in the various European institutions, whether we're talking about the EU, the European Union, the Western European Union, OSCE, have not yet developed the capacity for leadership that the United States has. Part of the answer is that none of these individual countries have the critical mass of the United States. Part of it is that they don't have the tradition of international leadership, and I think we can see that the UN is not yet in a position to carry out this role. I mean, that history demonstrated itself in Bosnia. So the leadership, if it's going to take place, is going to have to be American leadership. I see no alternative to that. But that doesn't mean that the United States has to bear all or even the majority of the burden. For example, the American percentage of troops on the ground in Bosnia is about 25% today. It's going to go down to about 20%. The European role in providing economic assistance is much greater than ours. The one specific area where we feel the Europeans have not contributed as they should is on assisting the local police, particularly in the areas of training and equipment. We've actually provided the majority of the money for that, and we're going to be working to see that changes. but there just is no alternative to American leadership. Frankly, they tried and they failed. It didn't work.
Why not accept the reality of ethnic division and partition and face the reality that if it wasn't for the presence of American troops, that would be the normal course of events?
I think that if one looks at the society over time, over decades, perhaps even centuries, one cannot fairly come to the conclusion that the history of that part of the world is simply one of ethnic hatred. About a third of the people in what is now Bosnia-Herzegovina are the product of ethnically mixed families. I mean, the rate of intermarriage was very serious. The great tragedy was that when Yugoslavia broke up, and we could have a separate discussion on whether that really had to happen the way it did, very narrow-minded leaders exploited ethnic fears for their own purposes and encouraged a war for their own purposes. Again, most of the people in Bosnia-Herzegovina do not want partition, and that applies across all of the ethnic groups. If a peaceful partition and an exchange of population, say along the lines of what the Greeks and the Turks did in late 1920s, early 30s, were possible, I would argue it would have been done. It's one thing to throw that out as an option, but virtually all of the international mediators who looked at this, Cyrus Vance, Lord Owen, concluded that that kind of partition was not going to be a workable solution. Now, I have to take exception to the idea that we're going to be there forever militarily. We have consciously not set an end date for the presence of our large military forces, but we do have a reasonably fleshed out concept of when progress will be self-sustaining, what those circumstances will be, the point at which we think we can withdraw the substantial maneuver battalions, the heavy divisions, and leave behind perhaps some kind of military observer function, which probably will include some Americans, but it won't be anything of the scale that we see today. It will be a radically different stage where there will not be 7,000 American troops. We'd be talking about a relatively small handful, perhaps even unarmed military observers. So we think we can reach that stage in what I'll call a reasonable period of time, not decades, something rather less than a decade. But we're trying to be careful to avoid specifying a certain date, again, because that gives people who would oppose Dayton an incentive to hang on. And we found that when we said, hey guys, we're staying, all of a sudden the mental calculation changed. The war criminals who've been living underground thinking, you know, if I can hold on till June of 1998, I can get back to normal and come out of this cellar where I'm living like a mushroom, suddenly it looks like the rest of their lives. And that's one of the reasons why we've seen these 4 recent Serb indictees surrender, and it's one of the reasons why others who have been indicted are sending out feelers. Of course, another reason is that we've made known to them that we retain the option to bring them into custody through other means with the clear prospect of them getting hurt in the process. So partition's it's not in this administration's plan. Can I guarantee that our troops will be out on a date certain? No, I wouldn't try to do that. Can I guarantee we're going to be successful? No. We've stubbed our toes a lot, we've made mistakes, and we've learned from those, and we truly believe that we've hit on a combination of things that is making our effort increasingly effective, and that will continue to improve our effectiveness as time goes on.
Is Kosovo a contradiction to the policy which you just articulated?
Kosovo is, of course, not in Bosnia-Herzegovina, but it's in the successor state to Yugoslavia, in the Serbian portion of Serbia and Montenegro. And it is indeed a case of potential instability that concerns us greatly. We think that if not tended to in a responsible, sober way, Kosovo has the clear potential for destabilizing the whole region in ways that might even be more serious than what happened in Bosnia. So we're trying to deal with Kosovo early on before the situation deteriorates to the kind of circumstances that led to the heavy international involvement in Bosnia that we eventually saw. It's something that concerns us greatly.
But with this great discrepancy in the population, with 75% Muslim, and it's being controlled by Serbia, don't you have to do something?
Yes, and we're consorting with our partners in the international community to try and convince Milosevic that he needs to engage in a serious dialogue with the Kosovar Albanians and needs to give them, they need to have a different status. The situation is not going to remain stable with the current status that the Kosovar Albanians have. And actually, I think it's even worse than you believe. They're probably closer to 90% of the population in that particular area. We're trying to make sure that we have the support of the international community. And we've laid out a very clear set of steps that we expect the authorities in Belgrade to take. There is, even as we speak, a UN Security Council resolution being drafted that will impose an arms embargo on Yugoslavia. We're talking to our partners about a whole range of economic sanctions in addition to those that they already face. We're talking to the parties in Kosovo also to tell them that they have to enter negotiations without preconditions. Some have asserted that precondition is agreement to independence. That's not the way to start a serious dialogue. But we're trying to help out on this as best we can and to avoid the kinds of circumstances that we found in Bosnia-Herzegovina. But this is an extraordinarily serious problem, and the fact that we haven't been able to solve it does not argue that what we're doing in Bosnia-Herzegovina is destined to failure. They're two different stages.
Lodged within that question, is there a contradiction between favoring a multi-ethnic society in the case of Bosnia and apparently favoring ethnic separatism in the case of Kosovo?
Let me be very clear. We do not favor ethnic separatism in the case of Kosovo. We favor observance of human rights. We favor political resolution of the economic, social, and political challenges and injustices that are there. We also support the continued territorial integrity of the FRY. And so, although we have been very direct, very vocal, and very much out in front in addressing the legitimate concerns of the Kosovar Albanians, we do not support separatism. We do not see the breakup of the FRY as a desired outcome.
Can you trust Milosevic?
That's the easiest question I've had all night. Hell no. But let me flesh that out just a little bit, if I may. Srebrenica was one of the great tragedies of the war and just a horrendous event. But the people who were working the Bosnian problem individually and institutionally are not the people who are working it now. That was before you had the Dayton Peace Accords. It was before you had American leadership. That was when the United Nations was running the show, and it was very much a European show. That is our people operate under very different rules of engagement. Our outlook and our policy and our rules of engagement would not tolerate that, and the people, our military out in the field, would not have to ask Washington or New York about what's the right thing to do in those circumstances. They know, and I think it's for that reason that we have not seen them really challenged, except past the first couple months. People understand that we are not UNPROFOR. We're not what was there before. This is a different, a very different approach, and it's not one that will brook those kinds of outrages and challenges. On Milosevic, we do not in any way trust him. We deal with him based upon what we think are the objective realities. Our dialogue, our private dialogue is, let me call it, exceptionally candid in ways that one does not normally associate with diplomacy. And it wouldn't be diplomatic for me to get more specific. But it is an exceptionally candid one. We are using every effort to identify the pressure points and to apply pressure to those points. And that process has to be an international process if it's going to be successful. Otherwise, you would have alternatives, and you could just step away from the pressure. So we're trying to knit together the international community, and we've had a fair amount of success.
I think also lodged within that question is whether you feel that your actions and policies are comprehensive enough to deal with the complexity of the problem.
I certainly hope so. We don't claim any monopoly on wisdom. We do claim that we work very hard at this and that we try to consult widely. But we're open to new ideas. We have in place a strategy that has military aspects, that would deny weapons to Belgrade, that would deny what we call instruments of internal repression, that impose really severe economic challenges, and we're looking at further measures. For example, one of the things that we were prepared to do before this outburst of repression in Kosovo was to allow charter flights from the Yugoslav national airlines to come to the United States. We were prepared to look at permitting them to open a consulate someplace in the United States. We're prepared to look at other steps that they would have welcomed. Not dramatic breakthroughs, but meaningful steps. And we made it known that if there were to be some kind of outrage, that these steps would be revoked, that they were indeed reversible, and we promptly reversed them. And instead of making positive gestures towards Milosevic and his fellow countrymen, we have organized the international community to express its concern, its outrage, and its determination to take increasingly tough measures to see that this is reversed. We're also trying to support the process of accommodation. This takes a number of forms. The OSCE has a special representative, Felipe Gonzalez, very senior Spanish public figure, who we hope will undertake a mission to Belgrade and to Kosovo. We have made known that the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia applies in Kosovo, so that people who participated in the crackdown have to accept the possibility that they could end up on charges in The Hague. We'll be denying visas to people in the policy chain who are responsible for the crackdown. There are a number of things there. But none of them are predicated on trusting Milosevic, not one.
On the question of the return of refugees, the statement is made that a majority of people seem in fact not to want to return to their 1991 points of residence. And in conjunction with that, is there any program for compensating them for properties lost if they remain out of that original area?
You know, I think the answer to I have to challenge the assumption that the majority of people don't want to go back. I think that's a very complex decision, and it hinges on a number of things. First and foremost, will they be safe, or do they need to fear a firebomb in the night, or having their cars vandalized, or their children assaulted? Will they have a structure to which they can return? The damage to the housing stock in Bosnia-Herzegovina is truly amazing. And the third question would be, will there be an economic future for them if they go back to that particular area? I would argue that if one can respond affirmatively on those three considerations, that the majority of people indeed want to return to their original villages and towns. And that our challenge is to try and provide for that. And we're working on all fronts with the police, with economic reconstruction, with changing the political environment, and with repairing the housing stock. In Birchko, this very sensitive area to which I alluded earlier, about 1,000 Muslim families have already returned. And they've returned to houses that were by no means fully rehabilitated. The standard was they had to be 2 rooms that were winterized. That is, 2 rooms that didn't have gaping holes, that had windows, or that were sufficiently sealed up that they could be heated in some fashion. The rest of the house could be absolute rubble. And by that 2-room standard, with the prospect of a safe environment and with the prospect of very uncertain economic conditions, people want to go back. I think you're right, the Dayton does provide for housing for a compensation possibility, but I don't think that in the first instance that's going to be the approach that we take. I think first we're going to try and do the right things in creating a democratic polity and ensuring that the rule of law exists for everybody and that everybody has a secure environment, that the economy is revitalized. And we haven't really talked about the economy very much, but it was, severely damaged. Industrial output fell to 10% to what it had been before the war. Those are going to be our focus, and I think only later are we going to look at the question of compensation. And we've seen a lot of the intermediate steps that are necessary, such as passage of property laws, which will enable people, if they decide they don't want to return to their apartment or their house or whatever, to reclaim title and at some point down the road to dispose of it.
What's the status of the economy of Bosnia? What are you doing about it?
The economy is dreadful. Most people are unemployed. The typical wage earner in the Republic Srpska, for example, gets maybe $50 a month. There's adequate food. We don't find starvation or severe malnutrition. We're trying to revive the economy by putting forward a privatization program and undoing some of the privatization that took place to date. The hardliners in a number of cases sold state-owned enterprises to their cronies at something dramatically less than market rates and then gave them a monopoly and protected them from competition. So we're undoing that. For our part, we are providing, exclusive of refugee and humanitarian assistance, $200 million a year in economic assistance, which is aimed at rebuilding the municipal infrastructures in the country, and helping the privatization efforts, those key functions. Now that there's a government in the Republic Srpska that's cooperating, we will give assistance to the Republic Srpska, bearing in mind the legislative restriction that we have to ensure that our assistance does not profit people who have been indicted for war crimes, and we're pretty careful about that. So it's an economy that is both recovering from the damages of war and an economy that's trying to make the transition from communist operating principles to a free market. And we're going to be working on that a lot longer than we have maneuver battalions assigned to Bosnia. That's going to be a work in progress 10 years from now, I think. It's not a pretty picture.
The question is, under what authority are we involved in? Was it Kosovo that you had in mind, or in Kosovo?
Well, the government in Belgrade has tried to take the position that Kosovo is an internal matter and not properly within the purview of the international community. But when the Helsinki Accords were signed well before the end of the Cold War, they accepted the principle, along with the rest of the civilized states in Europe, that basic observance of human rights is a legitimate topic for international dialogue and concern. So on that ground, we take the position that what happens in Kosovo is properly our concern and that of the rest of the international community. We also take the position that under the various provisions of the United Nations Charter that deal with threats to security and peace, under the provisions of the OSCE Accords, again, that deal with threats to regional stability, that we have a legitimate interest and a legitimate role to play. Now, obviously, how we discharge that role has to take place under the authorities of the American Constitution and our political system. Tomorrow, there, for example, may be a vote in the House of Representatives on a resolution which would invoke the War Powers Act and provide for a constitutional test of that. And that particular resolution was reported out of committee unfavorably. That is, most people were against going down that road. But the full House is going to vote on it tomorrow. And as you can imagine, if the Congress were to approve that kind of resolution,
I think you've given us a wonderful feel for the administration's policy.
thank you very much.
And a lot of depth of information as well. Thanks so much. Good seeing you.